From the earliest of times, Java had been defined by trade. Its location dictated that it would be the center of commerce. It is near China, India, and Southeast Asia. The monsoon winds that blew south in the winter from India made it easier for merchants to arrive with their goods. After a few months, the winds changed direction and blew north, making it easy for the ships to return. Merchants of different nationalities traded peacefully together for many centuries. Their goal was to buy and sell, to make and spend money. The most explosive change to Java and the whole region, however, one that would destroy its harmony for centuries, occurred on a bright, hot June day in 1596. This catastrophe happened without forewarning from the gods. No lightning bolts, no falling stars, no eclipses of the moon or sun. 4 foreign ships entered Banten Bay, a lively port in Java. As usual, the town was bustling. The docks were full of foreign ships, Indian, Chinese, and Arabian. But these new ships were unusual. They were hideously defective, staggering through the bay, covered with barnacles and sea slime, listing dangerously. The crew was in no better condition. Their teeth had fallen out. Their noses were excreting bloody streams, as were their gums. They were filthy, and they smelled loathsome. It was as if they had just sailed to this harbor from hell itself. And for the people of Banten Bay, they might as well have come from that abhorrent place. This was the crew of a ship that had set out from the Netherlands many months before and had gotten lost a number of times as they tried to navigate their way to the heart of the spice trade. The crew now suffered from the effects of dysentery and scurvy. A Dutch trading company had hired the most depraved and contemptible of men for the voyage. The captain, Cornelius de Houtman, and his crew were the lowest of the low, men without moral compass, men whose only desire was to make money at whatever the cost to those around them. Their vulgar behavior soon raised the hackles of the Sultan of Banten Bay, and they were asked to leave. Angered, they killed, tortured, and raped. When they became exhausted by their vandalism, they departed, looking for other trading opportunities in the area. The ship stopped in a few other ports, where they managed to buy some spices before returning to Holland. As unsuccessful as the expedition was, it turned a profit, though a tiny one. That was enough for investors. The news of this voyage and the interest which it excited created what might be called the inception of Dutch colonialism. This blight lasted 347 years, from approximately 1602 to 1949. Within 5 years, more than 65 Dutch expeditions arrived in Southeast Asia. They all competed against each other for spices and profits. In 1602, many of these rival Dutch trading companies got together to form the VOC, the United East India Trading Company, in an attempt to eliminate the fierce competition between them. 21 years after Cornelius de Houtman's voyage, Jan Coen, Governor-General of the VOC, began to monopolize trade for Holland. By 1682, the Dutch, under Coen, had ousted the Portuguese and the English from the archipelago. They then took over the spice, coffee, and rice trade. The Dutch were willing to do anything to turn a profit. Wanting to monopolize the nutmeg trade on the Banda Islands against the express will of the people there, the Dutch killed, enslaved, or deported many Bantenese. When the Dutch arrived, there were 15,000 natives in Banda. When they completed the takeover, there were fewer than 1,000. After a few years of grueling, thankless work, that number diminished to under 100. The VOC lasted from 1603 to 1800. By the mid-1600s, it was a huge empire within itself, comprised of 150 merchant ships, 50,000 employees, and 10,000 soldiers. As time went by, the problems caused by its incompetence became unmanageable. Its capital, Batavia in Java, became very unhealthy. Many parts of Batavia were below sea level. The Dutch had built canals as they had in Amsterdam, but over time these became filled with garbage. Diseases such as malaria, scurvy, typhus, pleurisy, pneumonia, and dysentery were so rampant that a new employee from Europe had only a 50% chance of staying alive more than a year after arriving in this disastrous environment. By 1770, the bottom of the European spice trade fell out. The VOC could have turned to other products had it been more flexible, but corruption and mismanagement had depressed its earnings. In 1796, the VOC went bankrupt and the government of Holland took control. The Dutch were oppressive and tyrannical towards the native peoples. The government controlled the type and quantity of crops. The peasants had to give 1/5 of their crops to the government, and they had to work in government fields for 60 days per year. Even in one of the most fertile places in the world, the farmers were unable to grow enough rice to sustain their own families. They began to suffer from famine and disease. Many farmers might have wished to move to the remote areas of Java, out of reach of the Dutch, but were forbidden from leaving their hometowns by law. They were prisoners in their own villages. The Dutch overlords grew fat on the work of the peasants. Up to 33% of the income of the Netherlands came from the toil of the poor in Indonesia. The Dutch took no interest in the well-being of the people. They built infrastructure only for commercial purposes or for the benefit of the Dutch overlords. There were no schools, no hospitals, no roads, and a court system where natives had no chance of attaining justice. In 1900, there were only 23 indigenous students in secondary schools. When the Dutch needed more native bureaucrats, they increased that number, but by 1930, there were only 6,500 Indonesians who had graduated from secondary school. Toward the end of the Dutch tenure in 1942, only 3.5% of the Indonesian population could read or write. Over time, the more enlightened people of the Netherlands were shocked by the treatment of the Indonesians under Dutch rule. They demanded change. Over time, conditions improved somewhat, but not enough. From March 1942 until September 1945, the Japanese occupied Indonesia. At first, the Javanese rejoiced to see the end of the Dutch occupation. They had suffered at the hands of greedy Europeans for more than 350 years. But the Japanese soon showed that they were as bad or worse. Java's rice was used to feed Japanese soldiers, and up to 2 million Indonesian people died of malnutrition during their occupation. The Japanese also sent people to work on the Pekanbaru Railway project, making train tracks in the deep jungles of Sumatra. About 70,000 people died doing this work. On the 6th of August, 1945, a Bandanese man with an illegal radio was hoping to get some news. There were rumors that the Japanese war effort was not going very well, and he was anxious to know exactly what was happening. The listener heard a strange word. He did not understand its meaning then, but would remember it forever once he did understand. The word was Hiroshima. 9 days later, the Japanese surrendered. The Japanese had hoped the Javanese would help them defeat the Allied forces. For this reason, they had trained, educated, and armed many Javanese. As a consequence, when the Japanese left, the Javanese were in a good position to fight the Dutch for their independence. On the 16th day of August, a day after the Japanese surrender, young Indonesian rebels kidnapped Sukarno, the leader of the independence movement. They were impatient. They had waited all of their young lives to be free. They did not want moderation. They did not want negotiation. They did not want to methodically plan for independence. They wanted it now. They demanded that Sukarno declare independence immediately, and they were very persuasive. The next day, on the 17th of August, 1945, 2 days after the Japanese surrendered, Sukarno stood in front of his home in Jakarta and read the following statement. "We, the people of Indonesia, hereby declare the independence of Indonesia. Matters concerning the transfer of power, etc., will be carried out in a conscientious manner and as speedily as possible." The etc. took a long time, 5 more years and a bitter struggle, until the 17th of August, 1950, when the Dutch finally transferred sovereignty to Indonesia, and the Republic of Indonesia was born. The etceteras are still being worked out today. Setting up a national government in Indonesia was a Herculean task. Each of the approximately 900 permanently inhabited islands with their over 700 languages had developed differently. They shared neither a language, a culture, nor a history. The Mataran and Majapahit empires had defined areas in the wide archipelago and beyond, but there was never a place called Indonesia in the consciousness of the local inhabitants. People belonged to a village, a community, an island, an ethnic group. People did not feel they belonged to one country. Java has been and still is the most populous, the richest and most powerful, the best educated, the most sophisticated island in the archipelago. Java was feared by the other islands. To them, there was a distinct possibility that Javanese colonialism would replace Dutch and Japanese colonialism, reducing all other regions to servile satellites. One of the main questions in shaping the newly independent government was whether it should be a federation with powers distributed throughout the archipelago, or a unitary state with a strong power center in Java. Sukarno, the first president of Indonesia, wanted a unitary state because he knew the idea of Indonesia itself was a very fragile one, and so strength and guidance were needed in building a new nation. Sukarno was an audacious, charismatic oligarch, one who was at first universally loved by the people, whom he ruthlessly charmed and enchanted. He was a visionary, but had trouble implementing his bold ideas. Over time, his policies upset many constituencies, mainly because they were socialistic and strangled free trade, which had brought great prosperity to the archipelago in the past. Commerce had been the lifeblood of the people for millennia. With Sukarno at its helm, the economy of Indonesia languished. He was interested in grandiose ideas, not the nitty-gritty of the economy. Hyperinflation occurred in 1964 and 1965. The military was well funded, while all other economic sectors struggled. Bridges, roads, schools, and public buildings began to crumble or were never built at all. Poor harvests occurred at the same time. People went hungry. Under these conditions, support for Sukarno faltered. He was the first president, the father of his country, but the people who once loved and supported him were now suffering. Students were restive. They wanted change. They demonstrated, and the army used violence to stop them. On the 13th of September 1965, 6 senior generals were kidnapped and killed by a group of young officers. It is still unclear what happened on that day, but it is believed that the young men thought they were protecting Sukarno from a right-wing coup. The Communist Party, the PKI, was blamed for these killings, despite the fact that Sukarno was very supportive of this party. The enemies of the Communists, particularly those in the army, began to spread vicious rumors. They said that the generals' bodies had been mutilated in a deranged orgy, and that the Communists intended to inflict this same violence upon Muslims, Christians, and nationalists as well. By late October, a nationwide wave of violence exploded. Many different groups used this incident to air pent-up rage. Communists and Chinese merchants were torn apart by frenzied mobs. Fires ravaged the towns. Mass slaughter erupted. In Bali, 1 out of 10 people died. In East Java, Muslims and army officers turned against communists, slaughtering them en masse. If anyone harbored a grudge against a neighbor, this was the time to kill them and reduce their home to a pile of rubble. The army arrested a huge number of people, interrogated them, separated those that they thought might be communists, and handed them over to civilian killing squads. The Kalimas River in Surabaya was filled with bloated bodies that had washed down from the countryside. When order was finally restored, more than 500,000 lay dead and 1.5 million imprisoned. On March 11, 1966, Sukarno, fearing further violence, relinquished power, turning it over to Major General Suharto. Suharto was an army officer whose advance was fueled by the death of all of his superiors, those killed by the kidnappers. Suharto, claiming to have saved Sukarno from a vicious communist plot, put Sukarno under house arrest, where he remained until his death on June 21, 1970. Sukarno was a flamboyant man, a handsome, charismatic figure. He had global hopes for Indonesia. He was the hero of the independence movement which defeated the Dutch. He shaped Indonesia into one nation through his grit and tenacity. He was not corrupt and died with little money. His love life, however, was operatic. He had 4 wives and a series of mistresses, the last of whom was a young Japanese bar girl. Sukarno was always the center of gossip, the center of attention, an exciting man who always kept the people enthralled with his personal melodrama. Suharto was the opposite. He was a quiet rural man who was married to one woman his whole life. As a young man, he left his job as a bank clerk after tearing his only suit in a biking accident. He was practical and began with simple aims: better education, more prosperity for the average citizen, good crops, enhanced farming methods. Visionary dreams were not part of his repertoire. When Suharto took power, Indonesia was in great debt. Inflation was heading towards 700%, and the average yearly income was $50. The infrastructure of the country was in tatters. After all the violence, Suharto valued stability above all else, as did the Indonesian people. They wanted peace. They wanted to count on eating every day, educating their children, seeing a doctor when sick, and having a secure place to live. Suharto's tenure can be divided into two parts, the first 15 years and the last 16. For the first 15 years, he was vastly popular because he did provide his country with stability and economic growth. He held the over 900 permanently inhabited islands together when they could have split up in civil war after civil war. Suharto needed to restore economic well-being. By 1984, Suharto's policies had caused the economy to grow, inflation to diminish, and people's annual per capita income to rise from $50 to $600 per year. The government also built over 100,000 new schools. But the government had also instituted policies that assured that those in power would stay in power. Dissent was dangerous, but people accepted Suharto's abuse of power because their personal economic situations had improved and the country was stable. But Suharto's leadership was faulty in a way that people could not overlook. Suharto and his wife and children became greedy beyond imagining. Their avarice knew no limits. By the 1990s, people were unhappy about his corruption, cronyism, collusion, and nepotism. They began to look upon him as a kleptocrat. But it took the cataclysm of the financial crises that consumed all of East Asia to dislodge Suharto. The bubble of the Indonesian economy collapsed. The skyline of Jakarta and other big cities took on a ghostly look as construction stopped on the unfinished skyscrapers. Suharto's tenure ended as it began, with riots, bloodshed, looting, burning, student demonstrations, and attacks on Chinese ethnic minorities. Horrendous destruction resulted. Businesses, banks, shopping malls, hotels, and small shops all were destroyed. Over 1,000 people lay dead. People were hungry. People were frustrated by the serious economic crises in which the rupiah had gone from 2,400 to the dollar to 17,000. They had lost their jobs, and as they looked at the wealth of Suharto and his children, they rioted, burned, and killed. On May 21, 1998, Suharto resigned. He was placed under house arrest in May 2000. He had been in office for 32 years. He died in 2008. With Suharto out of the picture, Indonesians searched for another leader. Presidents came and went, but none of them proved to be very popular or able to address the chronic needs of Indonesians. The first, the second, the third, fourth, and fifth presidents were elected by the parliament. But in 2004, the rules were changed. The first real participatory election occurred in Indonesia, and the people took great pride in their engagement in this historic event. With a nail pushed through a ballot sheet, they voted. There were very few negative incidents during this election. 104 million people voted at the more than 500,000 polling stations all across the country. The people formed long, peaceful lines, waiting for the opportunity, the first in the history of the archipelago, to vote. They did not take this day lightly. They knew that their grandparents or great-grandparents had never had this chance. They recognized the power that was in their hands. They had come so far from the early empires with their all-powerful kings, from the colonization of the Dutch, and from the authoritarian regimes that preceded this election. After Suharto, the country did not always run smoothly. It was hard to convince all of the people who inhabited the archipelago that they were indeed Indonesians. The country lost East Timor in a very bloody rebellion. There were civil wars in Aceh, Maluku, and Papua. The first 6 presidents were from the political elite or from the army. The current president, elected first in 2014, was different. His name is Joko Widodo, but is often called Jokowi. He came from a poor family, went to ordinary Indonesian schools, and wound up as a furniture maker, a very successful one, before entering politics. As an entrepreneur, he traveled to Europe and saw the great cities there and wanted to replicate their beauty in Indonesia. Jokowi practices grassroots politics. In casual attire, without an elite retinue, he visits schools, slums, hospitals, markets, and offices, and engages people about their lives, their ideas, and their aspirations. When Jokowi was elected, it was revolutionary, similar to Obama's election in the U.S. Jokowi was the first president from a poor family. Wealth and status in Indonesia had been the only path to success before him. His presidency brought hope to all who were born into struggling families. Jokowi said at that time, quote, "Now it is quite similar to America, yes? There is the American dream, and here we have the Indonesian dream." Like many other countries, Java is becoming more urbanized. The capital, Jakarta, is one of the largest cities in the world, a megatropolis that is continually growing. Many of the inhabitants there become globalized and lose their sense of community, the basic construct of their previous life in their native village. Getting ahead becomes their goal. Capitalism is what buoys them up. The smaller communities, the hamlets, the villages, and the towns, retain the collective spirit. People share. They share their entertainment. They share the maintenance of their communal infrastructure, spending their free time repairing roads, schools, or canals. They share Wayland puppet shows, festivals, weddings, funerals, their quiet evenings in the open air. Their sense of community keeps them safe and happy. Jokowi is very popular. People believe that he is making their lives better. Hopefully, he will continue to move the country forward towards a future in which all Indonesians enjoy the fruits of their land.